So before we dive into any teaching, I thought we would just start with a chant to kind of ground ourselves and arrive. And this is a chant that I think I first learned at the Episcopal House of Prayer. But before we dive into that, let's just take a breath or two deeply and arrive in this space. Arrive in this moment. Arrive in these bodies. And the words of this chant, they're very simple. They're simply ever-flowing, unchanging one. And I like to think of this is one of my favorite names of God, that it points to the two fundamental dimensions of the divine life, that God is the ever-flowing, ever-changing dance of all that is, the ever-flowing one, and God is also the unchanging one, that unchanging bedrock of love in which everything is always held, and out of which nothing can ever fall. God, the ever-flowing, unchanging. And it's the kind of chant that once it's established, you can play with it. You can change the tempo or the tune or the melody or harmonize as the Spirit moves in you. And so join in as you're comfortable, and then let the chant evolve as you feel moved. So again, just returning to the breath and the heart and joining in when you feel moved to. Ever flowing, unchanging one, ever flowing, unchanging one. Ever flowing, unchanging one, ever flowing, unchanging one. 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 So I invite you to bring your finest attention to your breath, to the flowing of your breath. And then notice the rhythm of your heartbeat. the feeling of the coursing of your pulse through your body. I like to think of these as our built-in prayer beads, our breath and our heartbeat, always there reminding us of the divine life coursing through us, moment by moment. And as you're able, allow your awareness to drop down from your head space, from your mental space, where we tend to stake our seat of selfhood. And let awareness just drop into and rest in that space of your chest, in the space of your heart, where breath and heartbeat are held. And as you're able, breathe through warm tenderness of heart. And then as you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. So in the retreat that we just wrapped up at the Episcopal House of Prayer, we worked a lot with heart-centered contemplative practice and bringing our heart online and cultivating an awareness that's anchored in our heart rather than our head. And I invited people for whom it felt a little abstract to be told to put your awareness in your heart, to use what I sometimes call the back door into the heart. And I thought before we move into this talk, which will be engaging our heads quite a bit, we'll be looking a lot of ideas, and hopefully we can hold the ideas always against the backdrop of that heart space. And so the invitation I gave everyone, and if you want, you can close your eyes again. We're just going to return once more to the heart. And the invitation is to imagine, as you're able, that you are in the presence of a beloved. And a beloved can be a beloved someone or a beloved something. Could be a beautiful tree in your yard, or it could be a beloved cat or a dog or a beloved spouse or partner or a child or parent. Beloveds take so many forms. But call to heart a beloved in whose presence your heart opens in joy and gratitude and love. Perhaps that's that cat purring in your lap or a beloved walking through the door. And just feel for a moment what happens in the space of your heart as you imagine the presence of that beloved one. Perhaps even a bit of a smile comes to your face. And then gently, as you're ready and as you're able, I invite you to release the image of the beloved, release the object of your love, and just remain in that feeling of love. Allow that love to become now objectless. Now simply love, loving. Now simply love, radiating. The Sufi poet Rumi says that the highest form of love is love with no object. Love that just simply embraces, encompasses all. And then as you're ready, you can again gently open your eyes. It can be helpful in the cultivation of love and of heart to have a devotional focal point that awakens that love. It's hard to fall in love with an abstract God. We fall better in love with God through a human other or through creation, something that kindles that love. And then that love can grow and become more and more universal. So I invite you, as you're able, to drop into that heart space as we move through these ideas and feel the ideas against the backdrop of the heart. So what I want to talk about tonight is an emerging understanding of Christian tradition, of Christian wisdom. And I use the word Christian wisdom in the biggest sense possible. I hope you'll hear it not as an identity marker or a label, but really as a path, as a transformative path. And while I'll be using Christian language and framework, whatever your language or framework might be, I invite you to hear this in as big a way as possible. But what I want to explore is an emerging understanding of Christian wisdom that is unitive, that is, that sees from oneness, that sees from unity, what increasingly we're calling non-duality, a non-dual unitive vision that doesn't see from separation. A vision that is contemplative, that is a vision that's about the inner transformative journey, that's about transformation and spiritual awakening rather than simply a belief system. That is incarnational, by which I mean an understanding that celebrates embodiment and earthiness, that doesn't see embodiment and the world as a trap to be gotten out of. And finally, a path that is evolutionary, a path that believes in and hopes for the future, for the continued unfolding of creation. And we'll frame that thread in light of Teilhard de Chardin, the French Jesuit, and we'll look at who he is later. I'm sure a lot of you know his work and vision. And I want to explore this against the backdrop of what the Roman Catholic theologian Ewart Cousins called a Second Axial Age. And some of you may be well familiar with this term. How many of you have heard it before? How many of you, for you, is it a new idea of axial ages? Good, so a few of you. It's essentially about a period of time that Ewart Cousins saw us entering into that's about integration. That so often we've divided spirit and body. That's about the integration of spirit and body, of God and the world, of immanence and transcendence, of the rational and the intuitive, of the individual and the collective. So a period of deep integration that's called for, that's being called forth at this moment in history especially, that's needed at this moment in history if we're going to survive and make a leap forward as a species. And we'll look specifically at how Jesus and the wisdom of Jesus fits within this framework. So this idea of an axial age that Cousins used, he was piggybacking on an early 20th century philosopher named Karl Jaspers. And Jaspers proposed that there was this window in human history that was roughly between 800 and 200 BCE, when all of our great religious traditions had their initial emergence, when the headwaters of our great religion started forming. And so we had the Jewish prophets, the Hebrew prophets arising in Israel. We had the Buddha with his great awakening. We had Lao Tzu teaching the way of the Tao in China. All of this happening seemingly independently around the world, this great sort of flaring forth of a new consciousness. And it represented for us a kind of planetary shift in spiritual understanding. And what Cousins or Jaspers proposed was that up until this point, our spirituality as human beings had been largely earth-based. We found our original gods in the cycles and seasons and forces of nature and creation. And our identity was primarily tribal. We held our identity in our tribe and in the collective more than in the individual. The tribe took precedence. And with this shift, what started opening up was the possibility of the transcendent and an individual quest for God, for transcendence. And you can think of the Buddha who left his wife and child in the palace and went off in search of enlightenment, and Abraham and Sarah who left their family and went off in search of the one God. And so we started as a species breaking ties with the earth and with our sense of collective identity, tribal identity. We could break with that. And so the way we started forming our sense of salvation or enlightenment or spiritual awakening began to look an awful lot like escape. The goal of the spiritual life, of the spiritual journey, was to escape, was to disentangle yourself from the network of relationships that you were caught in, to disentangle yourself from the world that was holding you back from this transcendent truth. And with that came this deep sense that something's wrong with the world. Something's really fundamentally wrong and broken with the world, and we don't really belong here. We've talked about it in Western religion in terms of the fall. The world is fallen, it's broken, sin and fallenness. And in the East, it's been framed in terms of samsara, that we're caught in this cyclic, existence that's suffering at its core. And so the goal in either map is ultimately to get out of here, to attain the heavenly prize, the heavenly country, or to attain moksha, liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, up and out. And we've lived with that sense of sort of dis-ease with the world and with our bodies for a long time. And what Cousins said, and he proposed this in a brilliant book he wrote called The Christ of the 21st Century. Really wonderful collection of essays. And he said, we're on the cusp of a second axial age, a second great transformation that's changing spirituality all over again. And he said, when we look around us today, the picture's shifting dramatically. And today, more than ever, we have a sense of the interconnection of all life. You no longer have to be a mystic to understand that everything's one. Every field of knowledge is telling us this. Quantum physicists are telling us it's all one. Quantum entanglement, and you follow things down through molecules and atoms and quarks and leptons and bosons, and you hit sheer unitive mystery. Environmentalists and ecologists are telling us everything's one. It's one interdependent web of life. You tug one strand of the web, the whole web is going to move. And we're seeing this with climate crisis right now, with our climate change that's threatening the life not just of us, but of all species on the planet. It's all one. It's all interconnected. And of course, our technologies are raising our awareness of interconnection. The internet is literally interconnecting the world at a conscious level, and travel is interconnecting the world. And so we know today more than ever that we're all one. Whether we like it or not, we know that we're one and we deeply belong to each other and to the planet. And so our spirituality can't exclude each other or the planet. And so Cousins said, this is going to change the face of religion. This is going to overhaul the way we've done spirituality. And what he said is that we're picking up everything we lost in that first shift that birthed the religions. We're picking up our sense of connection to the earth, to our bodies, and to each other. We're picking up our sense of collective identity, that we're in this together. My identity is bound up in yours, what Desmond Tutu would call Ubuntu, that I am who I am because you are who you are, and we are creating each other. But we're not picking all that up at that old tribal level anymore. We're now picking it up at the global level. One tribe, one human family, one planet Earth. And so what we're finding is that sense of dis-ease, of unrest, that something was wrong with the world, that sense of longing in us. We long for the infinite, and we think we will find the infinite by getting out of the world. What we're finding is that the longing in our hearts, which we took to be the surest sign of our exile, in fact, that longing is the surest sign that we belong to this world, that we belong to the work of continuing the unfolding of the world, the becoming of a creation that is not yet finished. And so it's actually God's longing in and through us. We've taken longing to be a sign of God's absence, but what if longing is the surest sign of God's presence? There's a Sufi story that I dearly love. Sufism is the mystical tradition of Islam, of course, and it's told that this dervish, a seeker on the path, that she had such profound longing for God, and she would cry out to God night and day, Allah, Allah, longing. And one day, this cynic, the skeptic, passes by her and says, "You foolish dervish, you waste your time crying out for God, longing for God, and has God ever once responded to your cries?" It sends her into despair. She realizes, no, what am I wasting my life on? I've been longing for God, and God's never once responded to my cries. And then a messenger is sent from the beyond. And this divine messenger says, "Oh, beloved servant, your Lord would have you know that your longing is his response, is her response." Again, that our longing is God's longing in and through us to unfold ever more fully. And so our longing for a healed and a whole world, what if longing is what oneness looks like when it gets stretched through time and space and evolution as it tries to work itself out here in this dimension? What if longing is what oneness looks like as it seeks to unfold itself, as it seeks to become ever more conscious, ever more unified, ever more beautiful? And so again, the second axial vision, it's about integration, about binding together heaven and earth, spirit and body, time and eternity. And so if that's the case, we have to talk about salvation in a very different way. We have to talk about enlightenment in a very different way. It can't be my little spiritual fix. It can't be my personal salvation. It's got to be collective. It's got to be cosmic. We realize that we can't leave this earth or our bodies or each other behind in the process. We'll either awaken all together, hand in hand, or not at all. It's all of us. And the good news here, I think, is that we don't have to go and create new religions from scratch to get this, to create containers for this. Actually, the stirrings of this second axial impulse have been coursing through our religions for a long time, and we just haven't really taken notice of them as fully as we might have. And so I want to look at Christianity now in this framework. And for the longest time, scholars following Jasper's model, they just lumped the Christian tradition in with the first axial religions, even though it was birthed well outside of that window of 800 to 200. But what I want to suggest is that Christianity, or better, let's say the life and teachings of Jesus, along with currents emerging in all the other great traditions as well, that these were actually the first stirrings of this second axial impulse in the life of the planet, beginning around 2,000 years ago. And so the path of Jesus has always been a second axial integrative path that we've continually roped back into our first axial roadmaps. Muscle memory has just pulled us back into these old models. So I want to describe a sort of key element of the first axial map that has plagued our religions to this day. And it's the idea, the notion of a great chain of being. And this is sort of at the heart of all of our major mystical traditions. And it's the idea that out of infinite source, out of the infinite Godhead. Let's say we've got infinity up here. We've got the Godhead. We've got source. Out of the infinite flows in this sort of successive emanation from the most subtle realms, the most subtle, pure realms, all the way down to the coarsest, densest realms, down to the cosmos at the very end of the chain of being, where we are, this physical, dense, coarse world. And there's a notion in this map that's in most of our mystical traditions that as you move down the chain, you're essentially moving away from God. And so the spiritual life is essentially a journey of return, of swimming back upstream, of climbing back up the ladder to God. And most of us have inherited from this map a subtle or not so subtle sense that God is up, right? If you asked your kindergarten self, where's God? Where would you point? Up. The world is down and God is up. Matter is down and spirit is up. And we also have inherited a probably not so subtle sense that spirit is better than matter, right? Spirit is better than matter. Now, one of my mentors, Cynthia Bourgeault, who's an Episcopal priest, contemplative teacher, a lot of you know, she calls this model redshift. And if you don't know that word redshift, it's a physics term, and it describes the way that as the wavelength of light increases, that is, as it shifts into a lower frequency, it shifts to the red end of the color spectrum. So if you think of a candle or a candle flame or a lighter flame, when you look at a flame at the very base, there's that intense blue flame, right? At the most intense point. And as you move out from the blue flame, you move into yellow flame and orange flame towards the red end of the color spectrum. And so as the light weakens in intensity, as it moves away from the source, it moves to the red end. So red shift is the physics term for that. So Cynthia says we've essentially had a redshift metaphysics that say we're moving away from God as we move down here into the world. And in this model, the whole goal of the spiritual journey becomes to wake up and realize we're far from the source and then return. And if that's the goal of the spiritual journey, then it sort of makes this whole end of the great chain of being pointless. Why is it here in the first place if the whole goal is to wake up and get out of it? Why do we have a world? It's a big waste of time, right? So Cynthia suggests that this model is not the map that Jesus was working with, that Jesus was doing something fairly new and really metaphysically revolutionary in the kind of path he unfolded. And she says we could call this a blue shift model. So as we move down the great chain of being, it's not that we're moving away from God at the top. It's that God is moving more fully into expression, more fully into manifestation down here at the bottom. This is where God is happening, where God is becoming. And it's really beautifully captured in a saying from the Islamic tradition, in which the voice of God says through the Prophet Muhammad, "I was a hidden treasure, and I longed to be known, so I manifested the worlds." That the worlds unfold from the heart of God as God's own self-expression. That God is knowing God's self through the world. So as we move down the chain of being, we're not moving away from, but into the intensity, into the blue end of the flame, where God is most fully manifest and expressed and happening. So up at the subtle end of the spectrum, everything exists as pure potential, right? So imagine the infinite ground of being. It's pure potential. All possibility is within that infinite ground of being. All beauty, all love, all truth. And then ask yourself, what good is beauty if it is unexpressed? Could you even really call it beauty? What good is love that isn't expressed, that isn't in form? Could you even call that love if it's only potential? Could you even call it beauty if it's only potential? And so this dense physical end of creation exists to speak forth the names of God, the qualities of God, the possibilities held within the heart of God. So this gives a very high calling to incarnate existence. This is where God is being spoken forth. So the goal isn't to get out of this. God's been working for 14 billion years to get into this, and we're wanting to get out of it. So if we take the metaphysical map flip here, and we go back and we look at Jesus, it starts to become a little bit clearer what he's up to. You remember John the Baptist in our gospel narratives. John represents your classic first axial ascetic, right? John has separated himself from society. He lives out in the wilderness. He's fasting. He's a renunciate. And he waits for the people to come out to him. So that's a first axial model. Now, Jesus seems to have been mentored by John, baptized by John, but at some point Jesus breaks with that model and he turns it on its head. Jesus goes into the world, into the towns, into the villages, among the people. And what does he do? He feasts and he drinks and he dances, and his enemies in the gospel records call him a drunkard and a glutton. You remember this? This is in our canonical gospels. They call him a drunkard and a glutton. That's not what you would expect of your first axial ascetic. And then Jesus goes around hanging out with all the wrong people. He hangs out with the sinners, with the tax collectors, with the prostitutes. And he starts erasing all of our expected boundary lines between the sacred and the profane. And he says, hey, look, God is happening right here. God's happening in the midst of all of this. God's happening in the world. The kingdom of God is here. In the Gospel of Thomas, which was unearthed in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, Jesus says, the kingdom of God is spread out upon the face of the earth, and people fail to see it. Not the kingdom of God is up there at the subtle end of the spectrum and you'll get to go to it when you die. The kingdom of God is spread out on the face of the earth and you fail to see it. So at the same time that Jesus is doing this radical sort of incarnate thing, moving into the world, he's also integrating what we call the contemplative and the active life, which in the church we've had a tendency historically to pull these two apart. And in our religious communities, we've often had apostolic, active, engaged orders, and then our contemplative, cloistered orders, and you have to choose. Which one do you want, right? Again, it's either or, up or down. And not to knock that entirely, because of course there are different kinds of vocations in the world and different kind of ministries that we're all called to. But my point is that in Jesus, we don't see a strong bifurcation between those two paths. Jesus models what today we might call the path of the contemplative activist. For Jesus, mysticism and social justice go hand in hand. The inner life and the transformation of the world go hand in hand. They can't be pulled apart. And we know from the Gospels that Jesus had a regular contemplative practice and a contemplative rhythm to his life. In the Gospel of Mark, we actually have a record of one of his practices. Mark writes, early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up and went out to a quiet place, and there he prayed. That's a practice, something Jesus did regularly, early in the morning, while it's still dark, before the hustle and the bustle of the day begins, before, all the mental agitation has started up. He goes to a quiet place and centers himself in God before he moves into the world. And again, we see him creating this rhythm of retreat and quiet and prayer that's balanced with action and engagement and healing, meeting the needs of the world. And so in the Jesus model, in this second axial model, we could say, contemplation, contemplative life, is never about escape from the world. Contemplative life is always about a more full, more free engagement with the world. Contemplation is not about escape. It's about preparation for entering the world more fully. And so in our Jesus model of the spiritual life, contemplative practice is absolutely central and essential. It's at the heart of his own rhythm of life. And we see that it's what gives Jesus in his ministry enough inner spaciousness to move out of reactivity and defensiveness, enough inner spaciousness to cultivate compassion and love, enough inner spaciousness that we can actually begin to live from oneness, begin to live from wholeness. And from very early on, the Christian tradition has talked about bringing online another organ of perception. And it's what the tradition has called seeing with the eye of the heart. And the tradition has understood the heart not as that mushy-gushy center of emotions, but as an actual organ of perception through which we see from unity. So we see the desert tradition, the desert mothers and fathers in the early church, they talk about drawing the mind, drawing awareness into the heart. And they understood that our mental center, where our culture sort of teaches us to stake our center of selfhood, our rational intellective faculty, it tends to see by way of separation. That's what it does. It calculates, it quantifies, and it cuts the playing field up into subject and object, into either or, into us versus them sometimes. And that's well and good. We need a faculty that can do that to function in incarnate existence. We need to know how much sugar and flour to put into the cake when we bake it. We need to do that. But it's not our only mode of perception. It's not the only way we can see. And these early Christians said that the heart, when it's brought online, it sees and perceives holistically from the whole. And the heart reads the qualitative universe rather than simply the quantitative universe. The heart reads a world of qualities, of unity, of harmony, of truth, of beauty. These are read through the eye of the heart. And it's contemplation, it's contemplative practice that accesses that faculty. So the Christian contemplative tradition understood Jesus saying in the Beatitudes in this light, the saying that goes like this: "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now, we tend to hear that as, blessed are the pure in heart now, for they shall see God later when they die, right? But the contemplative tradition says, no, blessed are the pure in heart, for when you purify your heart, when you polish the mirror of the heart, when you open the eye of the heart, you see God right here, right now. You see the oneness of being. You see the one in whom we live and move and have our being. You see God in every face, in every aspect of creation. You see from oneness. And this is the place Jesus was teaching and living from. And he works constantly to break his disciples, his students, out of their dualistic mode of perception. He works to snap them out of the dualistic operating system that most of us function by. And you see it in a teaching as simple as love your neighbor as yourself. Not love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. No separation. What would it be to see that you are myself and I am yourself? That there's one self that we all participate in. You see it, of course, in what you do to the least of these, you do to me, because we're not separate. There is no other. And again through the Gospels, Jesus is trying to short circuit that dualistic tendency. There's a healing story, a story about, I think it's James and John, and they come running to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, Jesus, we've just run into these folks down the road, and they're healing people, and doing good things, and casting out demons in your name, and they're not in our club. They're not on our team. Do you want us to smite them? Do you want us to call down fire on them? And I always imagine Jesus sort of rolls his eyes, and he says, no, whoever is not against us is for us, even if they're not on our club, Stop playing this us versus them game. If we translate that into our contemporary interspiritual climate, Jesus, Jesus, the Buddhists and the Muslims are doing good. Do you want us to smite them? No, whoever's not against us is for us. We're in this together, guys. He does it by using these extreme examples in his parables of someone who had been othered in society. So the Good Samaritan. Of course, the Samaritan was considered a heretic within Orthodox Judaism. And he uses a heretic as an example of good faith. There's a Roman centurion of whom he says, in this Roman I found greater faith than in all the household of Israel, than in my own religious tradition. He's saying, he's using as examples of good faith heretics and pagans, right? And then he doesn't say, and then they converted to Judaism. No, he says he's pushing us to look for what is good and holy and true outside of our boundaries and boxes, outside of all the expected limits and the heretics and the pagans. And he refuses to create an other down to his dying breath. On the cross, the moment you could most forgive the guy for falling into the dualistic mind, he refuses to his dying breath to other those who would murder him. And he says, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. They cannot see the oneness, but I can see it, and I will not other them. And there's that beautiful prayer at the end of John's gospel before he goes to the cross, may they all be one. May they all be one. So he's constantly calling us into this unity. And so we see that Jesus' teaching, it was primarily about transformation. I think we can't remind ourselves enough that Jesus did not come primarily to propagate the identity marker Christian. Jesus' goal wasn't to slap the Christian label on as many people as possible. Jesus came to awaken hearts and transform lives. That was his essential work. And as much as the identity markers are helpful in transmitting that work in that tradition and that vision, good and beautiful. And as much as they hinder it, well, let it go. Go for the oneness. And so seeing contemplatively and seeing collectively are inherent to Jesus' vision and to the second axial roadmap. And we see this second axial vision continuing to develop in early Christian doctrine and the emergence of early Christian doctrine, most wholly and beautifully and fully in the doctrine of the incarnation. For God so loved the world that the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. That the Word became flesh and blood and bone and earth. It's a vision of a descending God. It's not the God that you have to climb up the ladder to get to. It's a God who is pouring God's self out into the world. So again, flipping the whole map on its head. Even in the New Testament, the vision of salvation, we see it's not the old individual understanding that we would expect in a first axial map. We often talk in the Christian tradition about our personal Lord and Savior. It's not the New Testament language. In the New Testament, salvation is always collective and even cosmic. St. Paul talks about the whole creation groaning in labor pains as it works to bring forth the children of God. Salvation is collective and cosmic. And so in this blue shift vision that we're talking about, we'd do better to simply throw out the up-down model altogether. Just get rid of this map. It's not about ascent and descent. It's much more this outward, expressive, expanding model. Everything moving out from the heart of God as the heart of God moves into expression. Everything held in that one heart and everything enfolded back into that heart. And to not give you the impression that only Christians get this, we see a very similar shift developing around the same time in the Buddhist tradition. Early Buddhism talked about the arhat, which the ideal was one who attained liberation, moksha, enlightenment. Essentially for yourself, you attain your own liberation and you're out of samsara. In Mahayana Buddhism, a new concept emerges, and that's the idea of the bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is one who attains awakening, but they forswear their own final liberation, their own final dissolution into nirvana. And they instead pledge, they vow to remain in the phenomenal world, working for the awakening of all sentient beings. And so you see in that a movement away from the individual escape model to the belonging and the collective model that we see in Jesus. Similarly, in Islam and in the Sufi tradition, the model is one in which contemplation is kept in the world. The Sufi orders never even developed along monastic lines. They said, how do we keep the contemplative life and mystical depth embodied in the world? And the way the Prophet Muhammad, who was a husband and a father and a statesman, kept it embodied in the world. And so we see in this period the shift awakening in all of our great religions that's towards integration. So the seeds for this second axial transformation, they've already been sown across the board in our religions. And now that we're entering a global era as a human species, they can actually begin to blossom in their proper context. This is the world in which they fit and make sense. And so we can begin to see Jesus as the initiator of second axial consciousness. That Jesus was the initial groundswell of a planetary wave of transformation that we're only just beginning to catch up with. It's taken us 2,000 years to catch up with him. He was so far ahead of the curve. And Teilhard de Chardin, who I want to bring in here to sort of wind things down, he said that the work of Jesus was to initiate a new phylum of love within the consciousness of the planet. And he said it was the energy of love, what he called the process of amorization, loveization. That it was the energy of love that if we give ourselves to it, if we let it unite us in a new higher order collectivity than we've seen or lived as a human family before, that it would drive human consciousness to its next evolutionary leap, which he called the Christification of the human species, the Christing of the human family. And I think the good news there is that if we drop the ball, well, maybe the dolphins will pick it up and they'll continue the evolution. Maybe one of the other higher primates will give a go at it. The heart of God will go on unfolding. But it would be a shame for us to miss this opportunity. It's taken 14 billion years for us to get to this point. Where self-reflexive consciousness allows us to become aware of the unfolding and now asks us to serve it in love. So it's a high calling that's set before us. And, even if humanity doesn't survive, what matters in the end is love. If we can't gentle climate change in time, we can gentle our dying as a species. Can we die in love? Can we ease the pain as our species goes to its death? Everything in the phenomenal realm will have an end. It's the nature of finitude. Everything will die. Humanity will have its end. This planet will have its end. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But will it end in love? Will it end in compassion and caring and gentling? Those are the only things that can help us meet the crises and maybe live through the crises But as it said of Martin Luther, he said, if you knew that the world would end tomorrow, what would you do? And he said, plant a tree. So we live in hope. But this is really where contemplative practice meets evolution. Because as we open our hearts in practice, as in practice we drop into that open, surrendered, non-identified presence, and we expand our consciousness, and we begin to see more and more from oneness, we're allowing that phylum of love to grow in the planet. And so contemplation is never about contemplative navel-gazing, because as we open our hearts, we're really striving to open the heart of the world. We're striving to open the heart of God. And as your heart opens and it touches my heart, it helps my heart to open. And my open heart touches someone else's heart and helps their heart to open. And little by little, the heart of God opens more and more and more. And so it's this contemplative, planetary, evolutionary context in which the wisdom of Jesus, I think, makes the most sense, actually comes into its own. And one of the questions that we face right now as the church, those of us who are in the church, is whether or not our Christian story is big enough to hold everything that we now know, everything we've learned in, say, the last 100 years about evolution, about cultural and religious diversity, everything that's coming at us. Is the Christian story big enough, or is it simply time for a new story? And the narrative in much of the progressive end of the church, I think, is particularly lacking in this regard. Progressive Christians are too often embarrassed. We often have a Jesus who's sort of demoted to a social justice prophet, and we don't want to say his name too much. And we don't know how to make our story take in the whole of reality anymore. We want to be inclusive and embrace science, and we're embarrassed and ashamed at our history of colonialism and imperialism and oppression and cramming theology down people's throats. And people feel that. People feel that your tradition feels watered down and that you seem to be embarrassed of it. And that's not very compelling. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got fundamentalist Christians who hold on to what, on its own terms, can be a very compelling, big picture narrative. But it comes at the cost of rejecting everything we've learned over the last 100 years. And so it has to maintain this strongly anti-intellectual bent that asks you to believe things like, Satan planted dinosaur bones in the fossil record to test your faith in six-day creationism. And Cynthia Bourgeault, I think, very wisely says that this isn't primarily because fundamentalists are stupid. It's because the human heart longs for coherency and meaning. We long to live in a coherent, meaningful universe. And so often in our modern and our postmodern world, we lack a strong sense of coherency and meaning. We lack a story that takes in the whole of the world and tells us why we're here. And that's what the fundamentalist narrative tries to do. It tries to restore meaning and purpose and coherence to the world. And it comes at the cost of shrinking the universe and shrinking the story. But if you can just keep your fingers stuck in your ears, it can work. And so this is why I think Teilhard de Chardin is so important. So we'll end with him. For those of you who don't know his story, he was a French Jesuit and a paleontologist, born in 1881, and he died in 1955 in New York City, actually, where he was essentially in exile because he had been silenced, was denied teaching posts, was sent off on archaeological digs to China so that he would be out of people's hair, because he was working to integrate, to synthesize Christian thought and mystical vision with evolutionary thought. And I think we need his voice perhaps more than ever right now. What I think he does, he found a way to give us a big picture, hopeful, and profoundly Christian narrative that's big enough to take it all in. And what he shows us is, I think, that it's not that Christianity is too small, it's that it's become root-bound in a small pot. You know, when something becomes sort of pot-bound, you plant a tree in a little pot, and it can only grow so big because the roots can only go so far. But if you take it out and plant it in a bigger pot, then it grows even bigger. We've planted Christianity in a really tiny pot. And if we can just take it out and plant it in a bigger one, or better, plant it in the earth, it can grow to its full proportions. So Teilhard's journey in a nutshell, it represents perfectly the tensions in this transition between a first axial and a second axial spirituality. He's an icon of the tension and the resolution of this problem. So as a scientist, he was in love with the world. He was in love with the earth, in love with matter, the history of life unfolding through the world. And as a man of faith, he had a mystic's heart, and he was in love with the absolute, with spirit. And he felt it like a tug of war in his being, because he had inherited this old map. And which direction do I go in? And he struggled to reconcile the currents. And for a while, he kind of looked at Eastern mysticism, and he found a sort of universal cosmic mysticism there. But he felt that a lot of our mystical traditions ultimately sort of saw the world as illusory. And you want to just return to a primordial unity. And he said, but I love the world. And so he looked at secular humanism, which loved the world and progress. But it was kind of a dead end in the realm of the spirit. And finally, he saw that these seemingly contradictory upward and downward currents, up to spirit, down to body, could be reconciled and united in a forward movement, in the movement of an evolving, becoming universe. And until very recently, most of us, we thought we lived in a fairly static universe. It had been created by God and set in motion about 6,000 years ago. God flipped the on switch, and then the universe just sort of plods along until God decides to flip the off switch and then hand out your report cards. And in a static universe, or worse, in a degenerative universe, which is what a lot of our traditions have taught. It's all going to hell in a handbasket. It's not just static, it's all going down. In a static or a degenerative universe, it makes perfect sense that the goal of the spiritual journey would be to swim back upstream, to get out of the world. But in an evolving and converging universe, that goal shifts dramatically. And the goal is about furthering the becoming of God, furthering the unfolding of the universe, joining that movement of becoming. And when Teilhard sees that, it all comes together and the tension collapses, the tension's resolved. And he intuitively, and I think rightly, connects this to the doctrine of the incarnation, to God becoming flesh and form in Jesus. But he saw that the incarnation wasn't simply a one-off, that it wasn't a one-time event, an isolated event, that God up there, out there somewhere, came down in a Jesus box for 33 years, slapped a Band-Aid on creation, and then took back off into, heavenly outer space. He said, no, the incarnation is this vast, unfolding cosmic process that's initiated in Jesus, or better, we could really say initiated in the moment of the Big Bang, and then awakened to in Jesus, and then it continues unfolding as the body of Christ, as the body of an awakening humanity. And we each contribute our part to the ongoing incarnation of God. Teilhard, he wrote, "We're all of us together carried in the one world womb, yet each of us is our own little microcosm in which the incarnation is wrought." The incarnation being wrought in all of us. So the body of Christ for him isn't a nice metaphor. It's quite literal. We are literally the ongoing body of the incarnate God. And in this light, we can see that Christianity and all of our religions, they're not the paths of return and ascent to God up the mountain. Rather, they're the paths flowing out from God as God flows ever more fully into form through the world. Teilhard, when he was in China on an archaeological dig, These were the days when a Roman Catholic priest celebrated daily Mass no matter what. And he didn't have a chalice or, wine or a paten or bread. And he wrote these words: "I will raise myself up beyond these symbols to the pure majesty of the real itself. I, your priest, will make the whole earth my altar, and on it will offer you all the labors and sufferings of the world. Over every living thing which is to spring up, to grow, to ripen, to flower this day, say again the words, 'This is my body.'" A Eucharistic universe. This came crashing home for me about 3 years ago in British Columbia. I was leading a retreat, and as we were heading to the retreat center, my host said, "Do you want to see the salmon spawning?" And I thought, not really. But I said, okay, I've seen them on TV. And we turned in a national park. And as we approached the water, you could hear the water. And we turned this bend through the trees, and there was the river. And there were these salmon, just exhausted, just pounding their bodies against the water. And some of them were finally settling in a place to lay their eggs. And then some of them were dying and just washing up along the riverbanks. And I looked, and there were hundreds and hundreds of salmon corpses lining the riverbank. And all of a sudden, I heard the voice of Jesus, the voice of Christ say, "This is my body given for you." It was as if those mother salmon were saying to their young, their future young, "This is my body given for you." And then as they died and washed up on the riverbanks, and the gulls came and plucked out their eyes and picked their flesh, they were saying to the birds, "This is my body given for you." And I was smack dab in a living icon of the Eucharistic universe. And I realized this is what Teilhard was talking about. The whole universe is an act of divine self-giving. The whole universe is God's constant self-giving. We live in a Eucharistic universe, and Christianity, the Jesus path, it isn't simply or primarily an institution, although it's that. It's truly an energy that's coursing through the life of the planet, planted into the planet from the heart of Jesus. It's primarily a way of seeing the world and a way of living in the world. And it's not so much that we need a new story or a new religion. It's again that we need to take our tradition out of that tight little pot it's bound in and let it sink its roots deep into the cosmos so that it can grow into what it's always been. This second axial, integrative, contemplative, incarnational, evolutionary, transformative path of wisdom. And we hear so many people running around like Chicken Little screaming, "The sky is falling, the church is dying, the church is dying, the pews are empty, no vocations." And I think this is great news, because what's dying is an imperial, institutional identity marker that we have mistaken for the Jesus path. And as that crumbles and falls away and collapses, we have an opportunity, an amazing opportunity to rediscover this living stream of transformative wisdom that's still flowing to us from the living heart of Jesus right now. We can find the worm coals beneath the rubble and, stoke them until they roar into a blaze of love. And so may that be so, and may it be us, and may it be love. Amen. So let's just sit for a few moments and just allow awareness to hum in your heart. Feel those currents of love and hope that are still coursing through the world and coursing through you with every breath and heartbeat. a hope and a love that exists beyond all outcomes. It's not dependent on an outcome. It's just dependent on your naked being consenting to love, wherever it takes us. And resting in that. Resting in that which we really are when everything else falls away. St. Paul says everything else passes away. But these three abide: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love. But we should probably just conclude with a little chant again to take us back into the night. Again, feeling into that beloved heart center, that bandwidth of your being that is your organ of perception that reads the qualitative universe, that reads conscious interrelationship and connection. The heart that is sensitized to that whole web of being in which we live, of which we are strands. To move into that heart and to know that it's through the channel of our open hearts that God continues to flow into form. Ever flowing, unchanging one, 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 ever flowing, unchanging one. So may we feel ourselves held in that ever-flowing current of love. May we know ourselves to be that current of love ever-flowing. And even as we move as this dance of life, may we know ourselves in the depths as the unchanging bedrock of love, of pure presence in which all is held, and out of which nothing and no one can ever fall. Amen and amen. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.